Hello Internet! Gino, aka That Pinguino, here again with another deep look. This time I'm taking a look at South Park The Stick of Truth, and I'm going to be looking at the combat system, and more particularly how to avoid the combat system in South Park. So, South Park The Stick of Truth is a role-playing game by Obsidian based on South Park, the popular Comedy Central TV show. The game is largely written by the writers of that show, so there's going to be some cursing in this video. I usually don't have cursing of any kind, but you can't avoid it with South Park, so sorry if you don't want to hear any, turn off the video now. But if you're sticking around, good. Now, South Park has a very basic JRPG, Japanese role-playing game style, combat system, and story. The game is largely a parody of game mechanics and game conventions, and the main character is a silent protagonist in the vein of a lot of Japanese role-playing games. And the combat is basically lifted straight from kind of the Final Fantasy school of turn-based combat, Dragon Quest, all those early, like, mid-90s role-playing games. You stand on one side of the screen, enemy stands on the other. At the beginning of the game, you kind of pick one of 4 classes for your main character, which are Fighter, Mage, Thief, and Jew. I actually picked a Jew for this run through. I like the Jew's abilities. The final ability to summon the plagues of Moses is actually pretty useful. But other than a couple of class-based abilities, there's not really a big difference between each of the classes. So there's no big penalty from picking the wrong character. You almost certainly will not have much of an issue with the combat in this game, because a lot of the enemies are pretty simple. Like, I just took out that ginger hall monitor with my Mongolian bow, which is super overpowered. If you can get it like 5 minutes into the first day. If you get it, you'll basically walk through the entire first day. It hits 3 times, does a ton of damage, and lights your enemies on fire. So, beating enemies and getting through combat in this game, not particularly difficult, though a bit tedious. So, the way to get around some of it is, in South Park, there are environmental cues you can take advantage of. Like, say, I just soak down those guys and then shoot this, and bam! Dead. And so, I just took out basically 2 enemies that I would have had to fight in regular combat if I hadn't used environmental cues. I still got 12 experience. I still was able to loot them for all of the items that they carried. It's exactly as if I beat them in regular combat, except I didn't have to go through the tedium of regular combat. You don't even get an additional benefit from beating enemies the old-fashioned way, in turn-based. So, here's another example. I could shoot that light, but my bow doesn't reach. So instead I'm going to shoot this telephone, and then when he gets close to it, shoot this stack of chairs, and bam! There's another 12 experience. I get to loot them just the same. And by using environmental cues and turning some of your abilities into kind of environmental tools, South Park The Stick of Truth is able to get away with very simple combat that it's pretty easy to fall into a rut in the combat in South Park because it's so simple. You can find strategies like, say, my Mongolian bow that I explained, that just, with the Mongolian bow on day 1, I just level everything. Once you get another particularly strong weapon, it usually will allow you to take out entire groups of enemies all in one hit. Like, I was able to get some ranged weapons later on in the game that ricochet, and I added fire damage and bleeding damage, so it dealt crazy damage over time. It hit all of my enemies. It basically allowed me to one-hit kill everything. Or 2 hits or 3 hits, like, I was never in jeopardy of dying. So, combat could have just been rinse-repeat of me using my favorite tactic, but instead, this game allows you to use some environmental stuff to short-circuit the combat. Right now, I'm just trying to get past this ginger bodyguard to see if... Oh, nope. Hall monitor did not have a way to kill him, but I did kill his 2 buddies before I had to go into combat. So even though I'm entering a regular JRPG battle, it is a lot faster than if I had fought this guy with his 2 buddies. So I don't have to deal with multiple turns. I'm going to probably kill this guy in like 2 turns. Actually 1 turn. By the hammer of butters.
I'm sorry.
Now, saying that the combat in this game is simple doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. It's very easy to fall into a rut. It's very easy to just not explore all the different options that this game avails you. But at the very least, the South Parkiness of the combat and the comedy therein really keeps the game fresh, as long as you do not overindulge in combat and try to level up. The leveling system in South Park: The Stick of Truth does not actually have you don't really need to level that much. It seems like the enemies scale to you. If they don't actually scale, they are very well groomed for whatever the bare minimum amount of experience you could have gotten. All the enemies that you run into will be just about around the bare minimum level of difficulty. So if you're over leveling, you will just walk through enemies that otherwise you might have like 3 seconds where you might actually die until you use a potion or something. So if you are getting into as many random battles as possible, they're not actually random. In the streets of South Park, there are enemies kind of like in Chrono Trigger, where they're just kind of standing out in the open, and if you walk into them, you get into a fight. If you run into as many of those fights as you possibly can, and they spawn infinitely, so you can do it as much as you want, you will see so much of this combat system, you will probably get bored with it, and it won't hold up. Even the boss fights will get painfully easy and just boring, because the bosses just have a ton of HP instead of actually challenging you all that much. So I recommend taking advantage of the environmental cues as much as you can, and taking advantage of the environmental hazards to eliminate as many enemies without actually fighting them as possible. Also worth mentioning, in this game you're given there are 4 possible summon spells you can get. Mr. Slave, Mr. Hanky, Jesus, and Mr. Kim from City Walk. All of those summons allow you to basically one-hit kill an entire group of enemies. It gives you an insta-win on one of your fights after you've actually entered the fight, whereas the environmental cues prevent you from even entering a fight. Those 4 summons allow you to basically, if you're dealing with a particularly dangerous battle, you can just say, okay, I'd rather not deal with this, and then summon in your summon. So even if you're at the very bare minimum of experience and equipment and strategy, like if you don't really understand what's going on, you get 4 get out of jail free cards to just win a fight other than boss fights. So for example, I can't summon anyone to deal with this hallway monitor boss. See, it's blacked out. But if this was a regular fight, I would, and there are regular fights that are a lot scarier than actual boss fights in South Park: The Stick of Truth. So being able to summon in someone to deal with the more difficult stuff for you is really useful for, not feeling a need to grind, not feeling a need to overindulge in the combat. So South Park: The Stick of Truth really gives you a lot of ways to get around what could be a pretty flat system and keep this combat system as fresh as possible for as long as it can. Just because if they did not give you all these different avenues to approach combat without actually having to go through the turn by turn, blow by blow, this game would not be nearly as fun as it is. If I had to see Butters hitting someone with his hammer 70 times instead of like 35, it would definitely wear on me a little bit. Especially seeing all of the enemy attacks as well. They're all very funny. They all have the trademark South Park over-the-top violence, but also kind of kid at heart. Like Butters running up and just hitting people with hammers, me shooting a bow that sets people on fire, and then the enemies are throwing dodgeballs. Like, there's a great blend between make-believe, pretend, kid fantasy stuff, like you have fart magic and some of your attacks clearly enter the realm of fantasy, and then there's the weapons that you're actually using, like there are ninja stars. At certain points you can actually, Butters hits people with a hammer, he throws hammers at people. So there's a nice blending between fantasy and also over-the-top violence, but if you have to see all of those abilities and all those different skills too many times, it really makes the game a lot less enjoyable. And the combat and the abilities and leveling systems are all pretty simple, so it's not like there's a ton of depth to explore there. So, I hope you enjoyed this look at South Park: The Stick of Truth and its combat system. It is pretty unique in how it deals with random encounters. Thanks!